Picture this: a dimly lit chamber deep within a castle, where whispers travel faster than the wind. Two kings, cloaked in secrecy, exchange vows not of friendship, but of power. Their hands meet over a parchment, its contents known only to a chosen few. This wasn't just politics, it was survival. Welcome to the shadowy world of medieval kingdoms, where thrones were won not just by swords, but by hushed conversations behind closed doors. For every battle fought in daylight, there were a dozen alliances forged in the dark, shaping the fate of nations in ways history books barely dare to mention. What if I told you that some of the most pivotal moments of the Middle Ages weren't decided on the battlefield, but in hidden meetings between monarchs who played a game far more dangerous than war? These weren't just handshake deals, they were lifelines, betrayals, and sometimes traps, woven with the precision of a spider's web. Kings and queens across Europe, from the windswept halls of England to the sun-baked courts of Spain, relied on these secret pacts to outmaneuver rivals, secure their dynasties, and even rewrite the map of the continent itself. But here's the twist: many of these agreements were so carefully concealed, their full details have only come to light centuries later, buried in forgotten letters, cryptic diaries, or the ruins of abandoned castles. So why does this matter now? Because behind every crown, behind every grand proclamation or bloody conflict, there was always another layer, a world of hidden agendas and unspoken rules. This is the untold story of medieval kings and their secret alliances, where loyalty was a currency and trust was the rarest treasure of all. Over the course of this journey, we'll unravel the mysteries of these covert deals, expose the betrayals that toppled kingdoms, and reveal how a single whispered promise could alter the course of history. Stick with me, because the truth is far stranger and far more thrilling than any legend. At the heart of every medieval kingdom lay a delicate dance of power. One wrong step and a ruler could lose everything. But why did kings and queens go to such lengths to keep their alliances shrouded in secrecy? The answer lies in the brutal realities of their world. Public treaties invited scrutiny, jealousy, and sometimes even rebellion. A king who flaunted his alliances risked provoking his enemies into striking first or alienating powerful factions like the nobility or the church. Secrecy wasn't just strategy, it was survival. Take marriage pacts, for example. On the surface, a royal wedding might seem like a celebration, but beneath the feasts and fanfare, it was often a carefully calculated move. A single union could merge two kingdoms, secure a disputed border, or even legitimize a shaky claim to the throne. But announcing such plans openly, that could ignite a firestorm. Rivals might intervene, offering better deals to the same family or even sabotaging the match entirely. That's why so many of these agreements were negotiated in hushed tones, with documents signed in private chambers and messengers sworn to silence. Some contracts even included clauses forbidding disclosure for years, sometimes decades after the fact. Military alliances were no less covert. Imagine a king promising troops to another ruler in exchange for gold or land. If word got out, neighboring realms might see it as a threat and form their own counter-alliances, sparking a chain reaction of tension. Worse, the church could intervene, declaring such pacts sinful if they disrupted the fragile peace between Christian kingdoms. That's why so many of these deals were sealed in coded letters or through trusted intermediaries: monks, merchants, even minstrels, who could carry messages without arousing suspicion. And then there were the economic treaties, the lifeblood of any thriving kingdom. Trade routes, toll exemptions, loans, these were the hidden gears that kept crowns solvent. But revealing them, that could trigger backlash from rival merchants, local lords, or even the common people if taxes were involved. Some kings went so far as to bury these agreements in monastery archives, far from prying eyes, ensuring only a handful of insiders ever knew the full terms. What's fascinating is how these secret alliances didn't just shape individual reigns, they redrew the map of Europe itself. a whispered promise between two rulers might decide the outcome of a war, the fate of a dynasty, or the borders of a nation. And because so much of this bargaining happened in shadows, historians are still piecing together the full story centuries later, uncovering fragments of truth in crumbling scrolls and half-burned ledgers. The deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes. The medieval world was run not just by crowns and swords, but by the unspoken words between them. In the year 800, as Charlemagne knelt in St. Peter's Basilica to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, a rumor rippled through the courts of Europe, one so explosive it could have rewritten the continent's destiny. Whispers spoke of a secret pact between the newly crowned Frankish king and Irene of Athens, the Byzantine empress who ruled from Constantinople, their alleged plan to unite East and West not through war but through marriage, merging their two empires into a single superpower that would dominate Christendom. The idea was as brilliant as it was audacious. Charlemagne, fresh from conquering much of Western Europe, lacked one thing: legitimacy in the eyes of the old Roman world. The Byzantines still saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome, viewing Charlemagne's imperial title as a barbarian pretension. But if he married Irene, the last ruling empress of Byzantium, their union would dissolve centuries of rivalry at a stroke. For Irene, the benefits were equally compelling. Isolated by political enemies at home, she needed a powerful ally to secure her throne. Together, they could dominate trade routes, crush rebellions, and face down external threats like the expanding Abbasid Caliphate. The negotiations, if they happened at all, were shrouded in layers of secrecy. Byzantine chroniclers later claimed messengers traveled between Aachen and Constantinople disguised as merchants carrying encrypted proposals. One account even describes a golden seal, a gift from Irene to Charlemagne, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. But why all the subterfuge? Because both rulers knew their courts would never accept such a radical move outright. Frankish nobility might revolt if Charlemagne tied his fate to a distant empress, while Byzantine elites would see the marriage as a surrender to an upstart Western king. Then, abruptly, the plan crumbled. In 802, Irene was overthrown by her own finance minister, Nicephorus, who had no interest in sharing power with Charlemagne. The empress was exiled to a remote island, and with her fell the dream of a united empire. The consequences were staggering. Instead of a merged superstate, East and West grew further apart, setting the stage for centuries of conflict between Catholic and Orthodox worlds. Charlemagne turned his attention to consolidating his own realm, while Byzantium spiraled into internal strife. What's tantalizing is how close history came to taking a different path. Had Irene kept her throne just a few months longer, had the whispers become reality, Europe might have been shaped not by division, but by an unprecedented fusion of cultures and power. Instead, the failed pact became one of history's great what-if moments, a reminder that even the most carefully laid plans of kings and empresses could unravel in the shadows. William the Conqueror's path to the English throne wasn't forged on the battlefield alone. It was carved in the shadows, where whispers and parchment held more power than swords. Long before his famous victory at Hastings, William spent years weaving a web of secret alliances so delicate, one misstep could have unraveled his ambitions entirely. At the heart of his strategy, a network of Norman nobles bound not by loyalty, but by carefully calculated promises, land, titles, and a share of England's riches, all exchanged in hushed meetings and sealed with oaths meant to stay hidden until the moment was right. But here's what most histories overlook. William didn't just rely on his own people. He turned to an unlikely group of allies, Danish mercenaries, descendants of the very Vikings who had terrorized England centuries earlier. To understand why, you need to see the chessboard as William did. England's king, Harold Godwinson, feared a Viking invasion almost as much as a Norman one. The Danes had deep ties to northern England, where many still remembered their rule. By secretly hiring Danish ships and warriors, William didn't just add muscle to his forces, he created a diversion. Rumors of Viking raids forced Harold to split his army, sending troops north to guard the coast while William prepared to strike from the south. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, and it only worked because the deals were struck in absolute secrecy. The most explosive secret, though, wasn't on the battlefield, it was in Rome. Months before the invasion, William sent envoys to the Pope, arguing that Harold had broken a sacred oath sworn on holy relics. The truth, that oath was likely extracted under duress if it happened at all. But with the Pope's blessing, William transformed his invasion from a power grab into a holy crusade, giving Norman nobles a moral excuse to rally behind him. The propaganda was so effective that many of Harold's own allies hesitated to fight, fearing divine punishment. Yet for all his cunning, William's greatest weapon was silence. When one Norman baron, Robert of Mortain, nearly leaked the invasion plans in a drunken boast, William had him confined to a monastery until after the landing. When Danish mercenaries demanded higher pay, he funneled gold through Flemish middlemen to avoid leaving a trail. And when Harold's spies got too close to uncovering the truth, William fed them false rumors of delays and bad weather. Every move was a calculated risk, every alliance a house of cards. What's chilling is how close it all came to collapse. On the eve of the invasion, a storm scattered William's fleet, and for weeks his men starved on the Normandy coast. Had Harold pressed his advantage, history might remember a very different outcome. But William's shadow diplomacy had already done its work. Harold's forces were drained, his allies uncertain, his attention divided. By the time the Normans finally landed, the real battle had already been won in the quiet spaces between trust and betrayal. Hastings was just the final act. King Philip IV of France, known as the Fair, wore his nickname like a mask, his polished reputation hiding a web of betrayals that would shock even the most ruthless medieval rulers. While history remembers him for crushing the Knights Templar, few realize how long he'd been plotting their downfall, weaving secret alliances with other monarchs to isolate and dismantle the order. This wasn't just greed, it was a calculated survival tactic. By the early 1300s, Philip's kingdom was drowning in debt from wars and failed currency reforms. The Templars, with their vast wealth and network of banks, were both a lifeline and a threat. They financed crowns, including Philip's own, but their power was so immense they could topple kingdoms with a single withheld loan. Though whispers began quietly, Philip's first move wasn't an attack, it was a feigned friendship. He invited Templar leaders to Paris as honored guests, even appointing their treasurer as his personal financial advisor. Meanwhile, his agents were gathering damning rumors, heresy, corruption, secret initiation rites. But these accusations weren't just for show. Philip needed buy-in from other rulers to legitimize his crusade against the order. His most chilling alliance, a covert pact with Pope Clement V, the newly elected pontiff whose rise to power Philip had secretly engineered. Through months of bacchanal negotiations, the king convinced Clement that the Templars' independence threatened the church itself. The papal bull suppressing the order wasn't just spiritual condemnation, it was the culmination of years of hidden diplomacy. But Philip didn't stop there. Across Europe, other monarchs were also indebted to the Templars, and he knew they might defend them. So he played on their vulnerabilities. To King James II of Aragon, he hinted at shared spoils, Templar lands along the Pyrenees. To England's Edward II, he framed the Templars as rogue agents undermining royal authority. Some rulers resisted at first, but Philip's whispers sowed enough doubt that when the arrests came, the Templars found themselves isolated, their usual protectors suddenly silent. The final stroke of Philip's scheme was timing. On Friday, October 13, 1307, his forces struck simultaneously across France, arresting hundreds of Templars in a single dawn raid. The date wasn't random, it was psychological warfare, embedding the Templars' downfall into superstition. Yet even as the knights were tortured and their grandmaster burned at the stake, the full scope of Philip's deception remained hidden. Documents vanished, witnesses recounted, and the Templars' fabled treasure, it never surfaced in the royal coffers, sparking whispers that Philip's allies, or even rogue Templars, had spirited it away before the king could seize it all. What's haunting isn't just the scale of the betrayal, but how thoroughly Philip rewrote the narrative. He cast himself as a pious king cleansing the realm of heresy, when in truth, he'd orchestrated the greatest financial heist of the Middle Ages. And the most unsettling question lingers. If the Templars were truly guilty of the crimes Philip alleged, why did he need so many secret pacts to bring them down? The answer lies in the shadows, where real power was never about righteousness, only survival. Henry II's empire stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a sprawling patchwork of lands held together not by loyalty, but by a masterful web of whispered promises and veiled threats. On the surface, he ruled as a powerful monarch, but his true genius lay in the shadows, where he spun alliances so intricate they could make or break his reign with a single broken vow. Unlike kings who relied solely on armies, Henry understood that control often hinged on the quiet loyalty of local lords, men who could turn a province against him with a word. His solution, a network of secret pacts, each tailored to exploit the ambitions and fears of those who held real power in his territories. Take his dealings with the turbulent lords of Aquitaine, a region notorious for its rebellious spirit. Instead of crushing dissent with force, Henry played a subtler game. He identified key nobles, men with grudges against their neighbors or ambitions for greater titles, and offered them private guarantees. Lands were promised, rivalries stoked, and rival lords discreetly undermined, all through hushed conversations in castle chambers or coded messages carried by trusted monks. One such deal, uncovered centuries later in a neglected abbey archive, reveals how Henry secured the loyalty of the Count of Angoulême by secretly granting him rights to disputed toll revenues, effectively bankrolling his influence while keeping the arrangement hidden from other vassals. But Henry's most audacious moves were in the north. To neutralize the threat of Scottish incursions, he didn't just negotiate with King William the Lion. He cultivated a shadow alliance with William's own brother, David, promising support for his claim to the Scottish throne if he kept the northern border quiet. It was a dangerous gambit, one that could have sparked civil war in Scotland if exposed. Yet for years it worked, allowing Henry to focus his attention elsewhere without fear of a second front. That is, until his own family turned against him. The unraveling began with his sons Henry the young king, Richard and Geoffrey, who saw their father's covert deals as proof of his distrust. When they rebelled in 1173, they didn't just raise armies, they weaponized Henry's own secrets. Richard, future Lionheart, exposed his father's pact with the Count of Toulouse, revealing it to the French king and painting Henry as a schemer who couldn't be trusted. The betrayal had a domino effect. Lords who'd secretly pledged loyalty to Henry now questioned whether their deals would be honored, or if they'd be the next pawns sacrificed in the Plantagenet family feud. What's striking isn't just how quickly Henry's network collapsed, but how deeply it revealed the fragility of medieval power. A king might rule by divine right, but his true authority often rested on flimsier foundations, gossamer threads of secrecy that snapped at the first touch of daylight. Henry spent decades weaving his web, only to learn the hard way that in the game of hidden alliances, even your own blood could become your greatest rival. And perhaps that's the darkest lesson of all. No matter how carefully you bury your secrets, someone always knows where to dig. Richard the Lionheart's legend as a fearless warrior hides a far more cunning truth. His reign was built on secrets, not just swords. While history remembers him charging into battle, the real drama unfolded in whispered meetings and coded messages, where a single hidden agreement could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Nowhere was this more evident than during the Third Crusade, when Richard faced an adversary as shrewd as himself, Saladin, the Sultan who had reclaimed Jerusalem for Islam. What followed wasn't just a clash of armies, but a shadow game of diplomacy so delicate, its full scope is still debated by historians today. Take the Siege of Acre, a turning point in the crusade. Publicly, Richard and Saladin were locked in brutal warfare, but behind the scenes, messengers slipped between their camps carrying offers and counteroffers. At one critical moment, Richard proposed something astonishing, a marriage alliance. His sister Joan, widow of Sicily's king, would wed Saladin's brother Al-Adil, with Jerusalem as their joint domain. To modern ears, it sounds like a fantasy, but for Richard it was cold calculation. He knew retaking Jerusalem by force would cost countless lives and leave the city indefensible. A negotiated settlement, however, could secure Christian pilgrimage rights while saving face for both sides. The plan collapsed when Joan refused outright, but the mere fact it was considered reveals how far Richard was willing to bend the rules of holy war. Then there were the unspoken truces. During the march to Jaffa, Richard and Saladin's forces often camped within sight of each other, yet battles were curiously sporadic. Why? Because both leaders had secretly agreed to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Saladin, facing unrest in his own ranks, needed breathing room. Richard, wary of desertions among his exhausted troops, played along. At one point, they even exchanged gifts. Richard sent fresh fruit to Saladin during his illness, while Saladin provided snow from Mount Hermon to cool Richard's drinks. These weren't acts of chivalry, but tactical pauses, allowing both men to regroup without losing prestige. The most explosive secret, though, involved Richard's capture. After the Crusade's stalemate, he embarked for home, only to be seized by Duke Leopold of Austria. Official accounts claim it was revenge for an insult during the Siege of Acre, but letters uncovered centuries later hint at something darker. Leopold had been excluded from Richard's private negotiations with Saladin, leaving him humiliated and suspicious. Worse, Richard had secretly promised the crown of Jerusalem to another rival, Conrad of Montferrat, only for Conrad to be assassinated days later. The timing was too convenient. Many believed Richard ordered the hit. When Leopold got word of these backroom deals, he saw his chance. Richard's ransom, a staggering 150,000 marks, wasn't just punishment, it was the price of secrets spilled. What's fascinating isn't just that Richard made these deals, but how they reflect a medieval truth rarely acknowledged. Even holy wars were governed by pragmatism. For all the talk of honor and faith, survival often depended on the deals made when no one was watching. Richard understood this better than most. His legacy isn't just the battles he won, but the shadows he mastered, and the ones that eventually mastered him. In the bitter winter of 1241, as Mongol horsemen thundered across the frozen plains of Hungary, King Bela IV faced an impossible choice. His kingdom was crumbling, his armies outmatched, and the whispers of his predecessor's greatest fear had become reality. The Mongols weren't just raiders, they were an avalanche. But what history often overlooks is that Bela didn't just brace for impact. He gambled on a desperate, secret strategy, negotiation with the enemy. For years, European rulers had dismissed reports of the Mongols' approach as exaggerated rumors. But Bela, wiser than most, had been gathering intelligence. His spies brought back fragments of a startling truth: the Mongols weren't mindless destroyers. They were master diplomats willing to spare those who submitted. So Bela did the unthinkable. Through Dominican friars and Ruthenian merchants, he sent covert envoys to the Mongol camp, offering tribute and even a tentative alliance against common foes like the rebellious Cumans. It was a calculated risk. If he could buy time or divert their wrath, Hungary might survive. The Mongols' response was chillingly pragmatic. Their leader, Batu Khan, entertained Bela's offers, not out of goodwill but to exploit the king's desperation. Mongol scouts had already mapped Hungary's weaknesses, and Batu knew Bela's overtures were a stall tactic. so he played along, stringing the Hungarians along with vague promises while his forces encircled their defenses. The final blow came at the Battle of Mohyl, where Mongol feints and false retreats lured Bela's knights into a slaughter. The king barely escaped, fleeing to the Dalmatian coast as his kingdom burned behind him. Why did Bela's secret diplomacy fail so catastrophically? The answer lies in a fatal mismatch of expectations. Medieval Europe operated on a code of honor, even among enemies. But the Mongols saw diplomacy as another weapon, fluid and unbound by oaths. To them, Bela's offers weren't treaties, they were reconnaissance revealing his fear and disarray. And while European kings obsessed over dynastic legitimacy, the Mongols cared only for results. When Bela hesitated to fully surrender, refusing to kneel in person, Batu lost patience. The fallout reshaped Europe. Bela's survival came at a cost. His secret dealings alienated allies like Austria's Duke Frederick, who exploited Hungary's weakness to seize borderlands. Worse, the Mongols left behind a lesson written in ashes. Some enemies couldn't be bargained with, only resisted. Yet buried in monastery chronicles are tantalizing hints of what might have been. Had Bela's envoys reached the Great Khan in Karakoram rather than Batu in the field, could a grander alliance have altered history? We'll never know. But one thing's certain in the shadow war between East and West, trust was the first casualty. Frederick II wasn't just a king, he was a paradox wrapped in a crown. Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and Crusader, yet excommunicated not once but twice by the very church whose legitimacy he relied upon. But here's the twist, his battles with the papacy weren't just public clashes of will. They were shadow games where secret deals and whispered promises often mattered more than papal bulls or imperial decrees. Frederick's story reveals a truth most medieval monarchs knew but rarely admitted. The road to power ran straight through Rome, and sometimes you had to play dirty to walk it. Take his first excommunication in 1227. Pope Gregory IX had branded Frederick a faithless oath-breaker for delaying his crusade. Publicly, the emperor raged, rallying his allies with fiery proclamations. Privately, though, he was already working the back channels. Through Cistercian monks and Sicilian diplomats, Frederick sent discreet assurances to Rome. He would still fulfill his vow, but on his own timeline. The real bargaining chip, his control over Sicily, the wealthy gateway between Europe and the Muslim world. The Pope needed Sicilian ports to launch church-sanctioned campaigns, and Frederick knew it. Their eventual reconciliation wasn't about repentance, it was a transaction, sealed with a secret understanding that the emperor would eventually march east. But Frederick's most audacious move came years later during his second excommunication. This time, Pope Innocent IV had declared him deposed at the Council of Lyon, urging Europe's nobles to rise against him. Instead of bowing, Frederick turned the Vatican's own weapons against it. He quietly cultivated dissident cardinals, promising them imperial protection if they challenged Innocent's authority. Simultaneously, he played the long game with France's Louis IX, positioning himself as a fellow monarch besieged by papal overreach. Louis, no fan of Rome's political meddling, began subtly blocking church actions against Frederick. The emperor even exploited divisions within the papal court itself, leaking documents that exposed Innocent's financial dealings to stir unrest among clergy. The brilliance of Frederick's strategy lay in its layers. While publicly decrying his excommunication as unjust, he was privately proving a dangerous truth, that a determined king could outmaneuver the Vatican at its own game. By the time of his death, though still technically excommunicated, Frederick had effectively neutered the papal threat. His son Conrad inherited an empire intact, not because the church willed it, but because Frederick had shown that even a pope's divine authority had limits when faced with cold, calculated resistance. Yet the most revealing part of this saga isn't Frederick's defiance, it's how often this dance repeated across medieval Europe. For every king who clashed openly with Rome, another was cutting covert deals in candlelit chambers. Henry II of England, after the murder of Thomas Becket, didn't just submit to papal penance. He quietly funneled gold to influential cardinals to soften his sentence. Alfonso X of Castile, when denied the title of Holy Roman Emperor, didn't accept defeat. He commissioned scholars to draft legal arguments undermining papal authority, planting seeds for future resistance. What these rulers understood was simple. The Vatican wasn't just a spiritual authority, it was a political powerhouse, and mastering its labyrinthine politics required both public piety and private cunning. The real power struggles of the Middle Ages often weren't fought with armies, but with carefully placed whispers, veiled threats, and the occasional well-timed bribe. And that's why Frederick's story still matters, because beneath the grandeur of crowns and mitres, medieval politics was at its core a game of shadows. Robert the Bruce's rise to power wasn't just a Scottish affair. It was a shadow war fought with the quiet collusion of England's own disillusioned nobility. While history paints his victory at Bannockburn as a triumph of sheer Scottish grit, the truth is far more tangled. Behind the scenes, Bruce cultivated a network of English barons who secretly funneled him resources, intelligence, and even men. These weren't traitors in the usual sense. They were opportunists, men like Thomas of Lancaster, whose feud with King Edward II ran so deep, they'd rather see a Scottish king win than their own. Letters buried in private archives reveal coded exchanges, Bruce promising Lancaster lands along the border if he withheld troops from Edward's campaigns, while Lancaster's agents turned a blind eye to Scottish raids. It was treason dressed as pragmatism, and it gave Bruce something priceless: breathing room. But the English weren't his only silent partners. Across the Irish Sea, Bruce spun an even riskier web. Gaelic chieftains, weary of English rule, saw in him a chance to reclaim ancient ties between Scotland and Ireland. In 1306, Bruce sent his brother Edward to Ulster with a bold proposal: unite against their common enemy, and the Scots would help crown an Irish High King. The offer wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. By opening a second front in Ireland, Bruce forced Edward II to split his forces, buying time to fortify Scotland's defences. The Irish campaign faltered in the end, but its true impact was psychological. Rumours of Celtic solidarity spread like wildfire, making English garrisons question who they could trust in their own territories. The most ingenious part of Bruce's strategy, though, wasn't the alliances themselves, it was how he kept them hidden. Unlike grand public treaties, these deals left no paper trail. Messengers traveled as merchants, their letters written in vanishing ink or memorized verbatim. One surviving account describes a pact sworn not on parchment, but over a shared cup of whiskey, the terms known only to those present. Discretion was survival, exposure meant death. When Robert's own sister, Christina, was caught smuggling messages to an Irish ally, she endured years of imprisonment rather than betray a single name. What's often overlooked is how these covert networks shaped Bruce's most famous victory. At Bannockburn, Edward II's army wasn't just outmaneuvered, it was undermined. Key English nobles arrived late, their contingents suspiciously under strength. Welsh archers, usually the backbone of Edward's forces, were inexplicably held in reserve. Coincidence? Unlikely. Bruce's silent partners had done their work, eroding English unity long before the first spear clashed. And when the dust settled, it wasn't just Scotland that had changed. The very idea of British power had been fractured, thanks to a king who understood that wars are won as much in whispers as in battle cries. The lesson of Bruce's reign isn't just about courage or tactical brilliance. It's about the power of the unseen, the alliances forged in shadows, the enemies who become quiet allies, and the way trust, carefully weaponized, can topple empires. For every sword swung on the battlefield, there were a dozen hands working in the dark, and that's where the real war was won. Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, rode onto the battlefields of France with a reputation for ferocity, but his true mastery lay in the silent deals struck far from the clash of steel. While his father, Edward III, waged war with grand armies and open challenges, the prince understood something more potent. In the fractured lands of Gascony, loyalty was a currency, and he intended to spend it lavishly. Gascony had been English in name for centuries, but its nobles were a restless breed, torn between distant kings and the lure of French gold. The Black Prince's genius was recognizing their discontent as an opportunity. Instead of demanding allegiance, he traded in secrets. Take the Lord of Albret, a Gascon magnate whose lands straddled vital trade routes. Publicly, Albret paid homage to the French crown. Privately, the prince offered him something more tempting, a cut of the lucrative war spoils and a pledge to defend his borders against rival lords. These weren't treaties signed in castles, they were whispered promises in hunting lodges, sealed with gifts of Bordeaux wine and English wool. Then there were the mercenaries, the so-called free companies that ravaged the countryside. Where the French crown saw lawless bands to be crushed, the prince saw potential. Through shadowy intermediaries, he funneled English silver to their captains, not to hire them outright, but to direct their chaos. A French supply convoy ambushed here, a rival lord's harvest burned there. Each act destabilized the region, making the prince's rule seem like the only bulwark against anarchy. The brilliance of this strategy, plausible deniability. When the French king complained, the prince could shrug, blaming brigands, even as his own coffers funded their raids. The pivotal test came in 1356 when the prince faced a rebellion in Aquitaine. Instead of marching in force, he played a subtler game. Letters from the era reveal how he exploited rivalries among Gascon nobles, promising the Count of Armagnac higher titles if he betrayed his rebel allies. Simultaneously, he accidentally let slip false intelligence about French troop movements, sowing panic in enemy ranks. By the time the rebels realized they'd been manipulated, their coalition had fractured, and the prince entered Bordeaux not as a conqueror, but as a peacemaker, a carefully crafted illusion. What's often overlooked is how these covert tactics extended England's grip on France for decades. The prince's successors inherited not just territory, but a blueprint: rule through division, buy loyalty with privilege, and let your enemies tear themselves apart. When the tide of war finally turned, it wasn't because of battlefield defeats, it was because the French learned to play the same shadow game, turning Gascon nobles back with promises of autonomy and pardons. The Black Prince's legacy, then, isn't just in the lands he held, but in the darker truth he proved. Sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't a sword, but a well-timed whisper. The year 1415 should have been France's moment of triumph. After decades of humiliation at English hands, the tide was finally turning, until one man's whispered betrayal shattered everything. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, wasn't just a French vassal. He was the kingdom's richest magnate, controlling trade routes, armies, and the loyalty of half the nobility. Yet behind closed doors, he was playing both sides in a game so treacherous, even his own allies didn't see the knife coming. It began with a feud that tore France apart. The Duke's bitter rivalry with the Armagnac faction had turned Paris into a battleground of assassinations and street brawls. But John didn't just want revenge, he wanted the crown itself. When King Charles VI's madness left France rudderless, the Duke saw his chance. Secret envoys slipped across the Channel, carrying offers to England's Henry V. Burgundy's support in exchange for recognition as ruler of conquered French lands. The terms were damning: promises to stand aside during key battles, to open city gates to English troops, even to sway public opinion by spreading rumors of Armagnac treachery. The most explosive meeting took place not in a castle, but a merchant's house in Calais. Disguised as a wool trader, John's closest advisor handed Henry a sealed letter outlining Burgundy's price, a third of France's territory, including Paris itself. What Henry couldn't know was that John had simultaneously promised the Armagnacs he'd defend them if they made him regent. This wasn't just betrayal, it was political judo, using everyone's desperation to elevate Burgundy's power. Then came the bribes, not just gold but futures. Henry pledged Burgundy control of the Champagne fairs, Europe's financial heartbeat, while John secretly bought off key garrison commanders with promises of English pensions. The final stroke, a staged kidnapping of John's heir, Philip, allowing the Duke to publicly mourn while privately tutoring his son in the art of double-dealing. When Burgundy's forces famously withdrew at Agincourt, leaving the French flank exposed, it wasn't cowardice, it was cold calculation. The slaughter that followed decimated John's rivals, leaving him the last powerful noble standing. But the real masterpiece was yet to come. As Henry marched toward Paris, the Duke reluctantly brokered the Treaty of Troyes, disinheriting Charles's heir in favor of Henry, all while positioning Burgundy as France's savior from civil war. The irony, John's web of secrets became his undoing. When he was assassinated in 1419 on a bridge at Montereau, his killers weren't just Armagnacs, they were men who discovered his private correspondence with England. His son Philip inherited not just lands, but the lesson that in the game of shadows, even the architect can become prey. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't its scale, but its intimacy. John didn't just switch sides, he weaponized France's internal fractures, turning brother against brother until the kingdom was weak enough to carve up. And the darkest truth, without Burgundy's secrets, the 100 Years' War might have ended generations earlier. Some victories aren't won with swords, they're whispered into existence, one lie at a time. Joan of Arc's story is often told as a divine miracle, a peasant girl hearing heavenly voices, rallying France's armies and crowning a king. But peel back the layers and a far more intriguing possibility emerges. Joan didn't act alone. Behind her meteoric rise stood shadowy patrons, powerful figures who saw in her the perfect instrument to salvage a crumbling kingdom. At the center of this web was Yolande of Aragon, the queen mother whose political acumen rivaled any king's. While history remembers Yolande as Charles VII's mother-in-law, she was also his most ruthless protector, pulling strings to keep his throne from slipping into English hands. And Joan, she may have been Yolande's masterstroke, a divinely anointed figurehead to unite a fractured nation. Consider the timing. When Joan arrived at Chinon in 1429, France was on the brink. The English held Paris, Charles's legitimacy was in tatters, and the treasury was empty. Yet within weeks, this illiterate farm girl was granted an army, a suit of armor, and an audience with the Dauphin himself. How? Because someone vetted her, someone with the resources to test her claims and the influence to fast-track her credibility. Yolande's fingerprints are everywhere. She controlled the purse strings of the rival Anjou faction, bankrolled Charles's court, and most tellingly, had deep ties to the Dominican friars who examined Joan. Records show Yolande's confessor was among those who declared Joan's visions genuine, a coincidence too convenient to ignore. Then there's the military support. Joan's victories at Orléans and Patay weren't flukes, they relied on seasoned commanders like the Duke of Alençon and La Hire, both Yolande's loyalists. Even Joan's iconic armor wasn't peasant hand-me-downs, it was custom forged by royal smiths paid for by unnamed backers. And when Joan urged Charles to rush to Reims for his coronation, it aligned perfectly with Yolande's strategy, a public spectacle of legitimacy that would undermine English claims. The crowning wasn't just symbolic, it was political theater orchestrated by pros. But Yolande wasn't the only player. The Duke of Lorraine, who first sent Joan to court, had his own motives. His territories bordered Burgundian lands, and a resurgent France could shield him from his powerful neighbors. Even the Church's later role in Joan's trial hints at bigger forces at work. When she was captured, neither Charles nor Yolande lifted a finger to save her. Why? Because Joan had served her purpose, uniting France under Charles, and her martyrdom only strengthened his divine mandate. Her death was tragic, but in the cold calculus of power, it was also useful. The truth about Joan isn't that her faith wasn't real, it's that faith alone couldn't have changed history. Divine or not, her rise required earthly architects, queens who needed a miracle, kings who needed a symbol, and a nation desperate for hope. Joan's genius was embodying all three, but the stage was set by those who knew exactly how to wield her light against the darkness. And that's the real secret of saints: they rarely walk alone. The Wars of the Roses weren't fought on battlefields alone. They were won and lost in the dim corridors of power, where whispers carried more weight than swords. At first glance, it was a simple dynastic clash between Lancaster and York, but dig deeper, and you'll find a labyrinth of secret pacts where today's ally could be tomorrow's executioner. Take the Nevilles, the so-called kingmakers of the conflict. On the surface, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was a Yorkist stalwart, instrumental in placing Edward IV on the throne. But behind closed doors, his loyalty was always negotiable. When Edward married Elizabeth Woodville in secret, sidelining Warwick's preferred match with a French princess, the Earl didn't just sulk, he spun a web of betrayal. Warwick's revenge was a masterpiece of covert diplomacy. He quietly reached out to Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen, promising to restore her husband, Henry VI, in exchange for her daughter's hand for his own. It was an unthinkable pivot, York's greatest champion switching sides, but Warwick knew power rarely came from honor. Their pact, sealed in the shadows of Angers Cathedral, hinged on one condition: absolute secrecy until the moment was right. When Warwick finally revealed his hand, landing in England with Lancastrian troops, even Edward was caught off guard. The king fled into exile, and for a brief, dizzying moment, it seemed the Neville gamble had paid off. But the Tudors, lurking on the periphery, were watching and learning. Henry Tudor, a fugitive in Brittany, understood something vital. In this war, no alliance was permanent. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, negotiating with disaffected Yorkists like the Stanleys, who controlled the north. These weren't public declarations, they were murmured promises, land grants hidden in coded letters, and marriages brokered under the guise of truces. When Henry finally faced Richard III at Bosworth, it wasn't just his army that decided the battle, it was the Stanleys who held back their forces until the crucial moment, waiting to see which side offered more. Their last-minute betrayal, whispered and prearranged, toppled a king and birthed a dynasty. The real lesson of the Wars of the Roses: survival belonged to those who mastered the art of the double game. Men like William Hastings, Edward IV's closest friend, discovered too late that trust was a luxury. One day, he was dining with Richard of Gloucester, the next accused of treason in a staged meeting and beheaded without trial. The charges were fabricated, but the message was clear. In this world, the deadliest blades weren't made of steel, they were secrets wielded by those who knew when to smile and when to strike. And perhaps that's the darkest irony of all. The conflict that began with noble claims to the throne ended not with a grand battle cry, but with a network of quiet betrayals, each one proving that in the game of crowns, the winners were always the ones who played both sides. Vlad the Impaler's reign wasn't just a saga of terror. It was a masterclass in ruthless diplomacy, where survival depended on knowing when to smile before striking. While history remembers him skewering enemies on stakes, his true brilliance lay in the shadows, where he spun alliances as sharp as the spikes he wielded. Take his relationship with Hungary's Matthias Corvinus. On the surface, they were bitter rivals, with Vlad imprisoned by the Hungarian king for years. But letters hidden in monastery archives reveal a startling truth. Their feud was a carefully staged illusion. Corvinus needed a deniable weapon against the Ottomans, and Vlad needed sanctuary to rebuild his forces. Their secret pact, Vlad would play the madman, drawing Ottoman attention while Corvinus funneled him gold and mercenaries under the guise of ransom payments. It was a gamble so audacious, even the Sultan's spies were fooled. Then there was Moldavia, where Vlad's cousin, Stephen the Great, ruled. Publicly, Stephen kept his distance, wary of provoking the Ottomans. Privately, the two carved up a clandestine strategy. Venetian merchants, eager to weaken Ottoman trade dominance, smuggled weapons across the Black Sea to both rulers, while coded messages detailed joint raids on Ottoman supply lines. One such raid in 1461 saw Vlad's forces, coincidentally, strike an Ottoman garrison just days before Stephen's troops arrived to rescue it, a choreographed dance of carnage designed to preserve Stephen's plausible deniability. But the real cost of these alliances came when they shattered. In 1462, with Ottoman pressure mounting, Corvinus abandoned Vlad, arresting him on fabricated charges of treachery. The reason: Hungary had brokered a backroom deal with the Ottomans, trading Wallach's independence for peace on their southern border. Vlad, now expendable, languished in prison while his family was slaughtered. Stephen, too, distanced himself, fearing his own throne would be next. The fallout was catastrophic. Without allies, Vlad's final campaign in 1476 became a desperate scramble, his once feared forces dwindling to a handful of loyalists. When he was finally beheaded, some say, by his own disaffected boyars, his head was sent to Constantinople as proof the Ottomans had broken the monster. Yet the cruelest twist wasn't Vlad's death, it was how his betrayers fared. Corvinus's pact bought Hungary just a decade of peace before the Ottomans swallowed half his kingdom. Stephen, despite his caution, spent the rest of his reign fighting the very empire he'd tried to appease. And the lesson: in Vlad's world, alliances weren't bonds of trust, they were blades, and sooner or later, every hand that held one got cut. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile's union wasn't just a marriage, it was a coup disguised as a wedding. Behind the pageantry of their 1469 vows lay a web of secret negotiations so explosive, revealing them could have sparked civil war. Isabella, third in line for Castile's throne, wasn't supposed to rule. Her half-brother, King Henry IV, had a daughter, Juana, whose legitimacy was whispered about in taverns but enforced by royal decree. Ferdinand, meanwhile, inherited Aragon's crown but not its stability, with rebellious nobles and an empty treasury. Their solution: a clandestine pact drafted not by priests but by lawyers in a backroom of Valladolid's archbishop's palace. The terms were stark. Ferdinand would rule as Isabella's equal in Castile, but their children would inherit both crowns, binding Spain together through blood rather than battle. The risks were staggering. Henry had already promised Isabella's hand to a Portuguese prince to secure his own alliances. Defying him meant treason, so Isabella played a double game, publicly feigning obedience while her supporters, like the powerful Archbishop Carrillo, smuggled Ferdinand into Castile disguised as a muleteer. Their midnight wedding wasn't just romance, it was a calculated strike, ensuring the marriage couldn't be annulled before Henry could react. When the king demanded Isabella return, she brandished a loophole, an earlier oath extracted under duress now void. The message was clear: she wouldn't be a pawn in anyone's game. But the real masterstroke came after Henry's death, when Isabella faced Juana's supporters in a war of succession. Here, the couple's covert networks proved decisive. Ferdinand's Aragonese spies intercepted letters between Juana's backers and Portugal, exposing their plans to partition Castile. Isabella, meanwhile, courted Castile's merchants by secretly promising tax reforms in exchange for their silence and their gold. By the time Portugal invaded, the pair had already bribed key garrison commanders to surrender without a fight, turning potential bloodshed into a war of attrition their enemies couldn't afford. Their tactics against the Moors were no less ruthless. While publicly proclaiming a holy crusade to reclaim Granada, privately they exploited divisions within the Nasrid dynasty. Ferdinand's agents funneled gold to Emir Abu al-Hassan's estranged son, Boabdil, encouraging his rebellion. When Boabdil was captured, Ferdinand didn't execute him. He released him, knowing the emir's fractured court would keep fighting itself. Isabella complemented this by offering Granada's merchants secret guarantees: surrender early and keep your property, resist and face ruin. One by one, the Moors' economic pillars crumbled as trade deals evaporated under the weight of whispered threats. The final piece of their strategy, the Inquisition, branded as religious purity, it was really an intelligence network, converted Jews and Muslims under threat of torture, revealed where Moorish gold was hidden, which nobles secretly practiced Islam, and which ports still smuggled arms to Granada. Every confession extracted wasn't just a soul saved, it was a map to another pocket of resistance they could crush. By the time Granada fell in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella had perfected a formula, public piety masking private pragmatism, where every prayer hid a plot and every alliance came with a dagger in reserve. Their legacy wasn't just a unified Spain, it was a blueprint for power. They proved that thrones aren't won by faith or force alone, but in the quiet spaces between them where the right whisper at the right time could topple kingdoms. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. History remembers them as the Catholic monarchs when their true religion was the art of the deal. Beneath the bustling trade ports of medieval Europe lay a shadow empire, one ruled not by crowns but by ledgers. The Hanseatic League, a sprawling network of merchant guilds, wielded more influence than most kings dared to admit. But their true power came from the silent partnerships they forged with monarchs who understood that gold could conquer where armies faltered. Nowhere was this dance of mutual exploitation more evident than in their dealings with Nordic and German kings against Denmark's Valdemar IV, a ruler who learned too late that commerce could be deadlier than war. Take Magnus IV of Sweden. Publicly, he railed against Hanseatic monopolies choking his ports. Privately, he was taking their bribes. Documents smuggled out of Lübeck's archives reveal how Hanseatic silver financed his war against rebellious nobles' loans repaid not in coin, but in trading privileges that strangled Swedish competitors. When Magnus's son Erik later tried to break free, the League simply shifted support to his rival Albert of Mecklenburg, plunging Sweden into civil war. The lesson was clear: cross the Hanse and your throne might vanish like a ship in fog. Even more cunning was their manipulation of Norway's Håkon VI. Desperate to rebuild his famine-ravaged kingdom, Håkon signed a secret pact with the League in 1360. In exchange for grain shipments to stave off starvation, he granted Hanseatic merchants exemption from all tariffs, a deal so lopsided Norwegian traders protested in vain. But the Hanse's real masterstroke was subtler. By controlling Norway's food supply, they ensured Håkon couldn't aid his father-in-law, Valdemar of Denmark, when the League moved to destroy him. Starvation became a geopolitical weapon. The showdown with Valdemar exposed the League's darkest tactics. When the Danish king dared to tax Hanseatic ships or bypass their middlemen, the merchants didn't just protest, they weaponized their network. German princes, their coffers fattened by Hanseatic bribes, suddenly rediscovered ancient claims to Danish territory. Swedish privateers, funded through Lübeck's shadow accounts, began raiding Valdemar's coast. Most devastating, the League's economic blockade in 1370, choking Denmark's access to Baltic grain, timber, and iron until Valdemar's own nobles forced him to kneel at the Treaty of Stralsund. What made these alliances so potent was their invisibility. Unlike vassal oaths or royal marriages, Hanseatic deals left no public scars. Kings maintained plausible deniability while merchants did the dirty work. A ledger entry could disguise a bribe as a loan, a trade embargo as market fluctuations, and when monarchs outlived their usefulness, the League simply erased them, financing rivals, inciting peasant revolts, or letting starvation do the rest. The Hanse proved that the real rulers of medieval Europe weren't always the ones wearing crowns. Sometimes they were the ones holding the purse strings. The Teutonic Knights marched into the Baltic under banners of holy war, but their true conquests were secured not by faith alone, but by whispered agreements that would make even the most hardened warlord pause. Behind their image as pious crusaders, the order cultivated a shadow network of alliances with the very rulers they were meant to subdue. Pacts so volatile, their exposure could unravel centuries of conquest. Take their dance with Duke Conrad of Masovia, the Polish noble who first invited the knights to Prussia in 1226. Desperate to crush Baltic pagan raids, Conrad offered them land in exchange for protection. What he didn't realize, the knights had already secretly negotiated with the Pope for full sovereignty over any territory they seized. By the time Conrad grasped their ambition, his own signature had gifted them a permanent foothold, and the order never looked back. Their Lithuanian dealings were even more audacious. While publicly branding Lithuania's pagan rulers as enemies of Christ, the knights maintained clandestine channels with rebel dukes like Vytautas, who saw the order as a tool to overthrow his cousin Jogaila. Letters buried in Malbork Castle's archives reveal how Teutonic commanders funneled arms and silver to Vytautas, betting his rebellion would fracture Lithuania and leave it ripe for conquest. The plan backfired spectacularly when Vytautas and Jogaila reconciled, uniting against their common manipulators. But the knights' boldest gamble came later, when they secretly backed a group of disgruntled Samogitian nobles promising autonomy if they betrayed their Grand Duke. The plot unraveled when a drunken knight boasted of it at a Riga tavern, sparking an uprising that turned the entire region against the order. Ironically, it was their own web of secrets that doomed them. In 1410, the Poles and Lithuanians, long divided, finally saw the truth. The knights thrived by keeping their enemies at each other's throats. At the Battle of Grunwald, where their combined forces crushed the Teutonic army, captured correspondence exposed years of double-dealing, forged land claims, bribed bishops, even plans to kidnap the Polish queen. The revelation was catastrophic. Former allies like the Livonian Order distanced themselves, and the knights' banking partners in Lubeck called in their loans. Within decades, their grandmaster was a vassal of the Polish crown, his once feared state reduced to a pawn in the very games he'd perfected. The lesson etched into those blood-stained parchments. No fortress, no matter how mighty, can withstand the reckoning when shadows betray their architects. The Teutonic knights built an empire on hidden hands and hollow oaths until the day the light found them. Manuel II wasn't just a Byzantine emperor, he was a man walking a knife's edge between survival and annihilation. By the 1400s, his empire had shrunk to little more than Constantinople itself, encircled by the rising Ottoman tide. Yet, even as his people prayed for miracles, Manuel was engineering a gambit so audacious it would have made his ancestors blush. He didn't just beg for aid from fellow Christians. He secretly courted the very sultans who sought to destroy him, playing both sides in a desperate bid to buy time. His most startling move, a covert plea to England's Henry IV, a king embroiled in his own dynastic struggles. Dispatched under the guise of a religious envoy, Manuel's ambassador carried not just appeals for crusading knights, but a shocking proposal: Byzantine gold in exchange for English longbowmen. The letters, rediscovered in the 19th century in a crumbling Venetian archive, reveal the sheer scale of Manuel's desperation. He offered Henry trade monopolies in the Black Sea, relics from Constantinople's churches, even his own niece's hand in marriage, anything to secure a contingent of those battle-tested archers who had devastated the French at Agincourt. But here's where it gets darker. While publicly decrying the Ottomans as infidels, Manuel was simultaneously sending secret gifts to Sultan Mehmed I, assuring him of Byzantine neutrality in exchange for delayed assaults. It was diplomacy at its most ruthless, playing east against west while his city starved. The Ottomans, of course, were no strangers to these shadow games. Mehmed's father, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, had once struck a secret pact with Manuel's predecessor, John V, promising to spare Constantinople if the emperor turned a blind eye to Ottoman raids in the Balkans. The deal held just long enough for Bayezid to crush his Serbian rivals at Kosovo, after which he promptly besieged the Byzantine capital anyway. This was the brutal calculus. Manuel inherited. Every whispered agreement with the sultans carried the weight of betrayal, but without them, his empire would collapse overnight. And collapse it nearly did. When Manuel's double dealing was exposed during a palace coup, his own nephew accused him of bargaining with the wolf to save the sheep. But the truth was far more cynical. For every Christian king who ignored Manuel's pleas, there were two Ottoman factions vying for power, and by carefully fueling their rivalries, the emperor stretched Constantinople's lifespan by decades. His final masterstroke, exploiting the chaos after Bayezid's capture by Tamerlane in 1402, playing Timur's lieutenants against Mehmed's resurgence until the Ottomans were too divided to deliver the killing blow. What makes these hidden ties so chilling isn't their treachery, it's their necessity. Manuel didn't collaborate with the enemy because he wanted to, but because every other door had slammed shut. And in that, he embodied the darkest lesson of medieval statecraft. When survival hangs by a thread, even the unthinkable becomes just another move on the board. The real miracle isn't that Constantinople fell, it's that it stood for as long as it did, thanks to a ruler willing to dance with devils in the pale moonlight. Constantine XI faced an impossible choice in the spring of 1453, beg for help from the very powers that had bled his empire dry, or watch Constantinople fall alone. His desperate pleas to Venice reveal a bitter irony. The same merchants who'd once stripped the city's wealth now held its last hope. Secret ledgers from the Venetian archives show the emperor offering everything left: ancient relics, trading posts, even the crown jewels, in exchange for ships and soldiers. The Doge's response, a paltry 5 galleys, delayed by bureaucratic wrangling until they arrived the week after the city's walls crumbled. But the real betrayal came from closer to home. A faction of Byzantine aristocrats, led by the Megas Douloukas Notaras, had been whispering with Mehmed II's envoys for months. Rumors swirled that Notaras believed Ottoman rule would safeguard their privileges better than Constantine's doomed resistance. When the emperor begged him to release funds to pay Genoese mercenaries guarding the vital land walls, Notaras allegedly sneered, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," a jab at Constantine's doomed outreach to Catholic Rome. Even the heroic stand of Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese captain who reinforced the defenses, was undermined by shadowy deals. Mehmed had secretly promised the Genoese colony at Galata neutrality if they withheld full support from Constantine. Their merchants continued trading grain to the Ottoman camp even as their countrymen died on the walls. The cruelest twist, Constantine's last-ditch attempt to exploit Ottoman divisions. On the eve of the final assault, he received word that Orhan, a rival Ottoman prince, might lead a rebellion in Anatolia. The emperor diverted precious gold to fund his uprising, gold that could have paid for more mercenaries at the gates. The revolt never materialized. Instead, the funds vanished into the pockets of duplicitous intermediaries, leaving Constantinople's defenders underpaid and demoralized as Mehmed's cannons boomed. When the end came, it wasn't just the walls that failed. It was the tangled web of broken promises, whispered betrayals, and half-hearted rescues that had propped up the empire's corpse for decades. Constantine died sword in hand, but the truth was clear. Empires don't fall by siege alone. They rot from the inside, hollowed out by the quiet knives of those who'd rather switch masters than fight them. Louis XI of France earned his nickname the Spider King, not for patience but for the invisible threads he spun around his enemies. While other monarchs waged wars with banners and cavalry, Louis preferred whispers. His court teemed with informants, merchants carrying coded messages in wine barrels, astrologers paid to predict rivals' moves, even a barber who doubled as a spy in the Duke of Burgundy's chambers. But his deadliest weapon wasn't surveillance, it was the art of the poisoned promise. Take his dealings with Charles the Bold of Burgundy. Publicly, Louis flattered the Duke, even kneeling to kiss his hand in feigned submission. Privately, he was bankrolling Swiss mercenaries to harass Burgundian borders and funneling gold to Charles's rebellious subjects in Liege. The goal, to exhaust Burgundy's treasury while keeping his own hands clean. One chilling episode reveals his method perfectly. When the Count of St. Paul, a Burgundian ally, hesitated to betray Charles, Louis didn't threaten, he tempted. He secretly offered St. Paul the hand of his own niece, alongside lands stripping Burgundy's northern flank. The catch: the Count must defect mid-battle, leaving Charles vulnerable. St. Paul agreed, but Louis, ever the spider, had already leaked the plot to Charles through a double agent. When the Duke executed St. Paul for treason, Louis shrugged, pocketing the confiscated lands anyway. The lesson was clear. Alliance with the Spider King came with a noose woven into the terms. Brittany's Duke Francis II fared no better. Louis wooed him with a proposed marriage between their heirs, while simultaneously bribing Francis's treasurer to siphon funds to rebel factions. When the Duke discovered the betrayal, Louis blamed overzealous advisors, then swiftly annexed Breton border towns under the guise of protecting them from instability. Even his allies weren't safe. The Duke of Lorraine, who helped Louis isolate Burgundy, woke one day to find French troops occupying key forts, a gift for his loyalty, Louis claimed, though the garrisons never left. The spider's web stretched beyond borders. He coaxed England's Edward IV into abandoning Burgundy by promising annual payments of 50,000 gold crowns, then intentionally delayed shipments until Edward, cash-strapped, lost the will to fight. For the King of Aragon, Louis dangled a shared crusade against Granada, all while urging the Moors to raid Aragonese coasts through back-channel hints. Every pact had a trapdoor, every smile a concealed dagger. By the time Louis died in 1483, his methods had reshaped diplomacy itself. Future kings would emulate his blend of espionage and deceit, but none matched his cold brilliance. His reign proved an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the surest way to unite a kingdom wasn't through glory, but through the slow, silent suffocation of anyone who dared oppose you. And perhaps that's the spider's greatest legacy, not the webs he spun, but the fear that kept his prey from ever tearing them apart. Henry VII didn't win the crown at Bosworth. He stole it in the years after, through a labyrinth of lies, bribes, and midnight deals that would make even the most ruthless medieval king pause. On the surface, his victory over Richard III marked the end of the Wars of the Roses. But beneath the pomp of his coronation, England was a tinderbox of rival claimants, disgruntled nobles, and foreign powers waiting to pounce. Henry's reign wasn't secured on the battlefield. It was bought in backrooms, with gold borrowed from Italian bankers and promises whispered to exiled traitors who could make or break his fragile throne. Take his dealings with the Yorkist remnants. Publicly, Henry played the magnanimous victor, pardoning men who'd fought for Richard. Privately, he was running a shadow campaign to neutralize them. Key figures like the Earl of Surrey found themselves invited to long stays in the Tower, not as prisoners but as hostages with comfortable lodgings, their freedom contingent on their families' good behavior. Others were quietly stripped of lands and titles under legal pretexts so flimsy, even Henry's own judges raised eyebrows. But the real masterpiece was his manipulation of John de la Pole, Richard III's heir. Instead of executing him, Henry kept the Earl close, dangling the possibility of restored favor while secretly paying informants to track his every move. When de la Pole finally rebelled in 1487, Henry's spies were already in his inner circle, ensuring the revolt collapsed before it began. Then there were the pretenders Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, each claiming to be a lost Yorkist prince. Henry didn't just defeat these threats, he dismantled them through a web of international intrigue. Warbeck's rebellion was particularly dangerous, backed by Burgundy, Scotland, and even the Holy Roman Empire. Henry's response: he turned their allies against them. In Flanders, where Warbeck found sanctuary, Henry's agents spread rumors that the pretender was actually a Portuguese spy, souring his support among local merchants. In Scotland, he exploited King James IV's youth, offering him a royal marriage to his daughter Margaret if he stopped sheltering Warbeck. The deal worked. James, sensing better prospects in peace than rebellion, handed Warbeck over with a shrug, but the spine of Henry's conspiracy was financial. The crown was nearly bankrupt after decades of war, so he turned to an unlikely savior, the Medici Bank. Through shady accounting and collateralized loans using future tax revenues as security, Henry funneled Florentine gold into bribes, spies, and mercenaries. In exchange, the Medici gained trading monopolies on English wool, making them richer while Henry bought himself an army of loyal informants. One ledger, hidden in the Vatican archives, reveals a single payment of 10,000 ducats to certain persons in Ireland to suppress Simnel's uprising. Another lists bribes to Breton fishermen to report any suspicious ships carrying Yorkist sympathizers. The darkest twist, Henry's own propaganda machine. He didn't just crush rebellions, he rewrote them. Court poets paid from the Medici loans churned out ballads painting Warbeck as a drunkard and Simnel as a puppet. By the time Henry was done, the very names of these pretenders became synonymous with fraud, their real histories buried under layers of carefully crafted lies. And that's the true legacy of Henry's shadow court. He understood something his predecessors didn't. Thrones aren't won by battles alone, but by controlling the story. Every whispered deal, every staged betrayal, every gold coin slipped into the right palm was a thread in the web that kept him in power. The Tudors didn't just rule England, they invented the playbook for how to survive when the whole world wants you dead. In the winter of 1384, a princess and a king made a deal that would quietly redraw the map of Eastern Europe, but not in the way you might expect. Jadwiga of Poland, just 11 years old, was already being groomed for marriage to secure her kingdom's future. Meanwhile, Hungary's Louis the Great, one of the most powerful rulers of the age, faced a crisis of his own: no male heir to inherit his vast domains. Their solution, a secret pact so delicate, its terms were never written down, only whispered in the candlelit chambers of Bude Castle. On the surface, it seemed simple. Jadwiga would marry Louis's chosen candidate, uniting their realms. But the real agreement went deeper: a silent understanding that Hungary and Poland would function as one kingdom, sharing resources, armies, and ambitions without the chaos of a contested succession. What made this alliance so revolutionary wasn't just its scale, but its subterfuge. Louis couldn't afford to alienate his nobility by openly naming a foreign queen as his successor, and Poland's magnates would never accept direct Hungarian rule. So they crafted a fiction. Jadwiga would choose her husband freely, while Louis's agents discreetly ensured that choice aligned with Hungary's interests. The key player, William of Austria, Louis's nephew and the intended groom. His sudden arrival in Krakow, by chance, just as Jadwiga came of age, was no coincidence. It was stagecraft, orchestrated by Hungarian diplomats who'd spent years bribing Polish bishops and nobles to back the match. But the plot thickened when Poland's lords rebelled against the arrangement. They'd glimpsed the truth that this marriage would make their kingdom a satellite of Hungary and pushed Jadwiga toward a radical alternative, Jogaila of Lithuania. Here's where the silent pact proved its genius. Rather than fight the shift, Louis's successors adapted. They allowed the Lithuanian Union to proceed, but with a catch. Hungary retained veto power over Polish-Lithuanian military campaigns, ensuring their interests were never threatened. The proof: when Jogaila marched to support his Lithuanian kin against the Teutonic Knights, Hungarian envoys mysteriously brokered a truce that left Poland's new ally stranded. Coincidence? Hardly. The ripple effects of this shadow alliance lasted centuries. By keeping Poland and Hungary informally aligned, Louis and Jadwiga's heirs blocked the Teutonic Order's expansion, curtailed Bohemian ambitions, and created a counterweight to the rising powers of Moscow and Austria. Yet because the pact was never formalized, it left no paper trail for rivals to exploit. No treaties to renounce, no borders to dispute, just a quiet understanding that when push came to shove, the two kingdoms would move as one. And perhaps that's the lesson here. Real power isn't always proclaimed from balconies. Sometimes it's the things left unsaid that shape the world. Secrecy was the lifeblood of medieval alliances until it became their poison. For every pact that reshaped history, another crumbled under the weight of its own hidden flaws. Betrayal lurked at the heart of these arrangements, not as an exception but as an ever-present risk. Take the fate of the Duke of Clarence, brother to England's Edward IV. He'd secretly bargained with the French during the Wars of the Roses, swapping sides for promises of land and gold. But when his correspondence was intercepted by his own sister-in-law, Elizabeth Woodville, the consequences were swift. Clarence wasn't just disowned. He was famously drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, a grotesque execution meant to send a message. Treachery, once exposed, left no room for mercy. Power shifts could unravel years of clandestine planning in an instant. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris, wasn't just religious frenzy, it was the explosion of a secret deal gone wrong. Catherine de' Medici had initially encouraged the marriage between her Catholic daughter and the Protestant Henry of Navarre, hoping to balance France's factions. But when an assassination attempt on the Huguenot leader Admiral Coligny failed, Catherine panicked. Fearing retribution, she and her allies pivoted overnight, turning a wedding celebration into a bloodbath. The lesson: alliances built on shifting sands could drown their makers just as easily as their enemies. Then there was sheer incompetence, the silent killer of covert plans. In 1486, the Earl of Lincoln conspired to place the impostor Lambert Simnel on England's throne, backed by Irish lords and Burgundian gold. Their downfall, a courier's drunken boast in a London tavern where details of the plot spilled alongside ale. Henry VII's spies needed only hours to dismantle the entire scheme. Similar blunders plagued the Byzantines, like the time Emperor Andronicus II entrusted a secret plea for aid to a Genoese merchant, only for the man to sell the letter to Ottoman scouts, revealing the empire's desperation. But the most tragic collapses came from misplaced trust. Elena of Aquitaine's rebellion against her husband, Henry II, relied on secret oaths from their sons and disgruntled barons. What she didn't foresee was Henry's network of informants among the clergy. When her letters were intercepted by a bribed monk, the rebellion imploded, consigning Elena to 16 years of imprisonment. The irony: her alliances had been solid, her strategy sound, but secrecy, once breached, left no path to recovery. These failures expose a brutal truth. In the shadows where medieval kings and queens played their games, the margin between triumph and ruin was razor thin. A single loose tongue, a change in the winds of favor, or even a courier's stumble could unravel years of plotting. The real cost of secrecy wasn't just the risk of exposure. It was the certainty that, sooner or later, every hidden thread would fray. And when it did, the consequences were written not in ink but in blood. From Charlemagne's near-miss marriage that could have merged empires to Burgundy's betrayal that prolonged the 100 Years' War, these hidden pacts prove one thing: history's greatest turning points often happened in whispers, not battle cries. The Tudors didn't just win the Wars of the Roses, they rigged the game with Medici gold and staged betrayals. Vlad the Impaler's survival hinged on playing both Hungary and the Ottomans, only to be abandoned when the politics shifted. And who could forget the Hanseatic League, a merchant cabal that bankrupted kings and funded rebellions from the shadows? These weren't just dirty secrets, they were the blueprint for modern power. Think about it: today's backroom deals and covert alliances, whether corporate mergers or geopolitical chess, echo the same tactics medieval rulers perfected. The Spider King's web of spies foreshadowed modern intelligence networks, while Ferdinand and Isabella's manipulation of Granada's trade mirrors economic warfare tactics still used today. Even the Teutonic Knights' downfall betrayed by their own double-dealing parallels how modern empires overextend through hubris. So here's the unsettling question. If we're still uncovering these conspiracies centuries later, what hidden pacts are shaping our world right now? The past teaches us that official histories are often fairy tales, sanitized to hide the messy truths. Maybe the real story of our time won't be in headlines, but in some future historian's discovery of encrypted emails or buried ledgers. If these twists gripped you, imagine what else lies buried in the archives. Drop a comment with the medieval mystery you'd unravel: lost treasures, vanished heirs, or the alliances we've yet to expose. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Behind every throne, there's always another secret waiting to be told.